Lonely Lumberjack paid $2 for woman with sack on her head at auction, marries her when she says name. The town of Elk Hollow was the sort of place where dust settled on everything, except gossip. In the summer of 1889, the heat was dry enough to crack the earth, and the only thing more parched than the land was the human heart. Eli Carver, the lumberjack from the high timberline, wasn't the kind of man folks talked to unless they had to. 6'4", shoulders like a barn door, hands scarred from years of swinging an axe. He came down from the mountains twice a month, once for supplies, once for silence. But that morning, the crowd in front of the sheriff's post was too big to ignore. It wasn't the usual trading day bustle. The air was sharp with tension. He followed the sound of shouting until he saw it, an impromptu auction run by a traveling merchant whose wagon looked one loose wheel from collapse. And standing on the makeshift platform, shackled at the wrists, was a woman with a burlap sack pulled over her head. $2, only $2 to take her away, the merchant barked, voice oily. No questions asked. The crowd laughed, some with cruel delight, others with that uneasy shifting of boots that meant they knew it wasn't right but wouldn't speak up. Eli felt his jaw tighten. The sack hit her face, but her posture, straight-backed, chin tilted slightly, didn't match the pitiful scene. What'd she do? Eli asked a man next to him. Ain't my business. Yours if you got the cash, came the muttered reply. Eli wasn't a man for rashness, but something in him moved before his mind caught up. He stepped forward, pulled 2 crumpled bills from his pocket, and tossed them on the platform. The merchant grinned, clinked the coins into a pouch, and shoved the woman toward Eli. Her wrists were cold in his grip, thin but unshaking. He led her away from the gawking eyes, though they were around the corner in the shadow of the livery stable. He pulled the sack off. The first thing he saw were her eyes, green like moss after rain, but guarded. Dirt smudged her cheeks, and a lock of dark hair fell loose over her temple. Name, he said quietly, not as a demand, but as an offering. She looked at him for a long moment, the kind that makes a man aware of every beat of his heart. Clara, she whispered. And in that moment, Eli knew, somehow, against every bit of logic, that he would marry her. Not out of pity, not because he'd paid the $2, but because saying her name had turned something in him from stone to flesh. The town would talk, of course. They always did. But by nightfall, when the wind picked up from the north and the pine scent rolled down from the mountains, Eli was already thinking about how to build a second chair at his table and how to keep Clara safe from whatever had put a sack over her head in the first place. He didn't yet know the danger that followed her like a shadow, or the secret she carried that could set the whole of Elk Hollow ablaze. But the first ember had already been struck, and in the Old West, a single spark could burn a valley to the ground. Lonely Lumberjack paid $2 for woman with sack on her head at auction. Marries her when she says name. The wind carried the bite of autumn when Eli led Clara up the winding trail toward his cabin. The climb was steep, the path littered with loose stones and pine needles, but Clara kept pace without complaint. Still, Eli noticed the way her fingers tightened around the strap of the old satchel she carried, as if it held the last pieces of her life. He didn't ask questions, not yet. In the Old West, a man learned to wait until the other person was ready, or until the truth came for you whether you wanted it or not. His cabin sat in a clearing surrounded by towering firs that swayed with the wind like old sentries. The roof needed mending, the door had a stubborn hinge, and the chimney leaned just enough to make a man wonder how it still stood. But to Eli, it was home. Clara stepped inside and paused. Her eyes scanned the room. The rough-hewn table, the bed pushed against the far wall, the wood stove in the corner with a kettle hanging over it. There was no hesitation in her, no flinch as if she were afraid, just a quiet measuring like she was deciding whether she could belong here. You can take the bed, Eli said gruffly, setting down her satchel. I'll sleep by the fire. She turned to him, her gaze steady. That won't be necessary. Her voice was calm, but something in it hinted at steel wrapped in softness. Over the next days, life settled into a rhythm. Eli chopped wood at dawn, and Clara cooked simple meals, though he caught her more than once staring out the window as if listening for something far away. She mended his shirts with small, precise stitches, and once, when she thought he wasn't looking, she ran her fingers over the edge of the axe blade, as if testing its weight in her mind. On the third night, the silence broke. A hard knock came at the cabin door just after dark. Eli opened it to find Sheriff Dalton standing there, his coat dusted with frost. "Evening, Eli," Dalton said slowly, his eyes flicking past him to where Clara stood by the stove. "Mind if I step in?" Eli stepped aside, his gut already tightening. Dalton removed his hat, but his tone stayed businesslike. "I hear you took a woman off that trader's hands in town, paid $2 for her." "What of it?" Eli's voice was even. Dalton looked at Clara. "Ma'am, is your name Clara Lee?" Clara's hands stilled on the kettle. "Yes, Sheriff." Dalton's jaw worked for a moment. "There's folks asking about you. Folks who came through 2 nights ago claiming you belong to them." A flicker of something, fear or maybe anger, passed through Clara's eyes. She didn't speak. Dalton shifted his weight. "I'm not saying it's true, but they were armed, and they didn't look like the sort to take no kindly." Eli's hand rested on the back of a chair, his knuckles white. "Then they won't like it up here either." Dalton studied him for a long second, then nodded. "Just thought you ought to know." When the sheriff left, the cabin felt smaller, the shadows thicker. Eli turned to Clara. "You gonna tell me who's coming?" he asked quietly. She met his gaze and her voice was steady. "Men who think they own me. Men who took everything I had. Except my name." Eli didn't press further. But that night, as the wind howled through the pines, he sat by the fire with his rifle across his knees, listening for hoofbeats in the dark. He knew trouble was coming, and trouble in the high timberline had a way of staying until blood was in the snow. Lonely Lumberjack paid $2 for woman with sack on her head at auction, marries her when she says name. By morning, the mountains lay under a pale mist, the kind that muffled sound and made a man's breath hang in the air. Eli was already outside splitting logs when Clara stepped onto the porch, a wool shawl tight around her shoulders. Her eyes swept the tree line, not with idle curiosity but like she was counting shadows. He offered her a tin mug of coffee. "Sleep any?" "Enough," she said, though the faint smudges beneath her eyes told a different story. For the rest of the day, the air between them was filled with unspoken things. Clara baked cornbread in the old cast-iron pan, and Eli took the mule down to the creek for water, each pretending the other wasn't watching for signs of strangers. But by dusk, the quiet broke again. This time, not with a knock, but with the distant echo of hoofbeats. Slow at first, then clearer, like the sound was climbing up the trail. Eli set his axe down and glanced toward the cabin where Clara was standing just inside the doorway. Her face was pale, but her jaw was set. 3 riders emerged from the mist, their horses slick with sweat. The lead man wore a long duster coat the color of dried blood, his hat pulled low over eyes that didn't smile. A rifle rested across his saddle. "Evenin'," the man called out as they halted a dozen yards away. "Name's Silas Greeley. I believe you got something belongs to me." Eli didn't move. "Don't reckon I do." Silas's mouth curled. "That woman came into Elk Hollow on the back of a trader's wagon. She's under contract to me." "She's not under anything," Eli said, his voice flat. Silas leaned forward in his saddle, eyes narrowing. "You got a church paper says you're wed? No? Then you best hand her over before this gets unpleasant." Inside the cabin, Clara stepped into view. Her voice carried, steady but sharp. "Silas, you don't own me. You never did." That drew a chuckle from one of the other men, a wiry fellow with a scar splitting his cheek. "Sounds like she needs remindin'." Eli's hand rested casually on the butt of his revolver. "You might want to ride on. This land's mine. So's the trail you came up. Trespassers don't tend to make it back down." Silas's eyes flicked to the rifle leaning against the cabin wall, then back to Eli. "You think you can stop us?" "No," Eli said. "I know I can." The standoff hung there, thick as the mist, until Silas finally gave a small nod. "Reckon we'll talk again soon." He turned his horse, and the three men rode back into the fog without another word. When they were gone, Clara let out a slow breath. "They won't stop," she said. "Silas doesn't let go of anything he thinks is his, and he's got men who'd burn this place to the ground if it meant dragging me back." Eli looked at her for a long moment. "Then we'll make it so they can't." She blinked. "You don't even know why they want me." "Don't need to," he said simply. "You're here. That's enough." But later, as he cleaned his rifle by lamplight, he knew he couldn't protect her blind. He needed the truth. Because in the Old West, the wrong secret could get a man buried without a marker, and Eli had no intention of letting that be his fate, or hers. Lonely Lumberjack paid $2 for woman with sack on her head at auction. Marries her when she says name. The next morning broke cold and sharp, the kind of chill that made the lungs ache. Frost clung to the cabin's single window, and the sound of the wind slipping through the pines felt like a warning. Eli was up before first light, oiling his rifle and checking the traps he'd set along the lower trail. When Clara woke, she found him outside, crouched near the fence post, staring at the ground. "Tracks," he said without looking up. "3 horses, same as last night. They circled halfway up the ridge, then turned back." She tightened her shawl. "They're watching." He straightened, his expression unreadable, and waiting. The tension followed them through the day. Clara tried to busy herself, washing clothes in the iron tub, hanging them on the line, but she caught herself glancing toward the tree line more than once. Eli spent hours in the shed, sharpening tools, reinforcing the shutters, checking the pistol he kept hidden under a loose floorboard. By late afternoon, he finally broke the silence. "Clara, what did Silas mean when he said you were under contract?" Her hands stilled over the kettle. For a long moment, she didn't answer. When she did, her voice was quiet but steady. "He runs a camp south of here. Not a work camp, not really. More like a pen. Women get brought in, some sold by their own kin, some taken by force. Once you're there, you're his property." Eli's jaw flung. "Got that you were taken." "Tricked," she corrected. "I was told there was work in the hills, cooking, sewing. When I got there, the gates locked behind me." She paused, eyes fixed on the fire. "I lasted 3 days before I slipped out during a supply run. He's been hunting me ever since." Eli leaned against the table, the wood creaking under his weight. "Why not tell me sooner?" Her gaze met his. "Because men like Silas have a way of making their enemies disappear. And I didn't want to watch you vanish on account of me." He let out a slow breath. Too late for that now. That night, the forest felt restless. An owl called from somewhere high above, and twice Eli thought he heard the snap of a branch too heavy to be wind. When he finally drifted to sleep, it was with the rifle across his lap and the fire burning low. Just before dawn, a sound woke him, a soft thud followed by a faint creak of the porch boards. His hand closed around the rifle as he rose silently. He opened the door and froze. On the porch rail sat a length of frayed rope knotted at one end and splattered with dried mud. Beside it was a scrap of paper, the handwriting jagged and uneven. "You can keep her for now, but she'll be mine when the snow falls." Eli's grip tightened until his knuckles went white. Snow in the mountains could come early, and once it did, the trails would be harder to guard. He stepped back inside, closing the door quietly. Clara was still asleep, her breathing soft, her face turned toward the firelight. He knew then that waiting for Silas to make his move was a fool's game. The only way to protect Clara was to take the fight to him before the snow came. Lonely Lumberjack paid $2 for woman with sack on her head at auction. Marries her when she says name. The first snow dusted the mountaintops 2 days later, a white warning against the dark pines. Eli stood at the cabin window, watching it creep like a gisiki. Or knowing Silas's promise was no idle threat. Men like him didn't wait. They closed in. Over breakfast, Eli laid out his plan. "We can't just sit here and wait for him to come. I'm going to find his camp." Clara set down her mug, her fingers trembling slightly. "You don't know what you're walking into. Silas's place. Yeah, it's not just him. He's got near a dozen men all armed and they know the terrain." "Then I'll move quiet," Eli said. Find out where he's keeping his supplies, where his men sleep. We make it so he can't come after you again." She shook her head. "He won't stop for burned supplies. He'll only stop if he's in the ground." The words hung between them, heavier than the mountain air. Eli packed light, rifle, hunting knife, bedroll, jerky, and a coil of rope. Clara followed him to the edge of the clearing, her shawl wrapped tight around her shoulders. "If you don't come back," she began, but her voice faltered. "I will," he said simply, then stepped onto the trail. The forest closed around him, muffling the sound of his boots on the frozen ground. He moved like a hunter, taking the long ridge path to avoid the main trail. By midday, he spotted smoke curling from beyond a low ridge, too steady for a traveler's fire. He crept closer, belly to the ground, until the camp came into view. It was worse than he imagined. A crude stockade of split logs enclosed half a dozen shacks and a central fire pit. 2 men patrolled near the gate, rifles slung lazily over their shoulders. Inside, he saw movement. A woman hauling water, another chopping wood under the eye of a man with a whip coiled at his belt. Eli's jaw tightened. He counted 8 armed men in sight, which meant more could be inside the shacks. He noted the supply shed near the back wall, guarded by a single bored-looking man. A ladder leaned against the wall nearby, leading up to a watchtower that stood empty. Nightfall would be his ally. He backed away, taking a wide arc through the trees until he reached a ridge where he could watch without being seen. He waited until the sun dipped low, shadows stretching long over the camp. The guards changed shifts, and the man at the supply shed wandered toward the fire pit. Eli moved. Silent, fast. He slipped over the wall near the watchtower, landing soft on the frozen dirt. Within minutes, he was in the supply shed, stuffing his pack with powder, ammunition, and dried food, not for himself, but to deprive Silas's men of it. Then he found something that made his blood run cold, a bundle of papers on the table, maps of the mountain trails with his cabin marked in black ink, and under it, a folded letter. "When the snow is deep, we'll come from the north ridge. The woman first, the man after." His gut told him they'd move sooner than the snow. A sound outside. Footsteps. Eli doused the lantern, slipped out the back, and scaled the wall in one motion. He was halfway into the trees when a shout went up from the camp. "There, in the pines!" Rifle shots cracked through the night, splintering bark around him. Eli ducked low, sprinting for the ridge. He didn't stop until the campfire glow was gone and the only sound was his own ragged breath in the dark. Back at the cabin, Clara looked up from the hearth as he burst through the door. "They know exactly where we are," he said, tossing the marked map onto the table. Her eyes widened, but her voice was steady. "Then we have to be ready before they get here." Eli nodded. "We will be." But he knew readiness alone wouldn't be enough. Not against a man like Silas Greeley. Lonely Lumberjack paid $2 for woman with sack on her head at auction. Marries her when she says name. The snow came faster than either of them expected. By the end of the week, the trail to the cabin was buried in white drifts, and the trees groaned under the weight of ice. The mountain had gone quiet, but it was not the peace of safety, more the hush before a storm breaks. Eli and Clara had turned the cabin into a fortress. Every window was barred with thick planks, the doors reinforced with extra beams. Eli had dug firing positions into the snowbanks and stacked wood high near the stove. His traps were set along every approach. Still, Clara could not shake the feeling of eyes on them. On the 4th night, just past midnight, the sound came. A single muffled hoof step on frozen earth, then another. Eli was already by the window, rifle in hand. "They're here." From the dark tree line, figures emerged. Silas Greeley at the front, his long duster coat dusted white with snow. Behind him came 7 men, moving slow but sure through the drifts. They carried rifles, shotguns, and the kind of confidence that came from thinking the fight was already theirs. Silas stopped 20 yards from the porch, his breath clouding in the cold. "Carver," he called. "Send her out, and I might let you keep breathing." Eli stepped onto the porch, his rifle aimed square at Silas's chest. "You'll take her over my dead body." Silas grinned. "That's the plan." He raised his hand and his men fanned out. The first shot cracked the night, not from Eli's rifle but from Clara's. She fired from the cabin window, dropping one of Silas's men into the snow. Another tried to rush the porch only to be caught in a snare that yanked him off his feet. Then the fight began in earnest. Gunfire roared, the sharp reports echoing off the mountains. Eli moved with practiced precision, dropping targets and shifting position before return fire could pin him. Clara reloaded as fast as she could, her hands steady despite the chaos. Silas's men pushed forward, but the snow worked against them, slowing their charge. One stumbled into a concealed pit, another fell to a swinging log trap that slammed into him with bone-breaking force. In the midst of it, Silas advanced, his eyes locked on Clara's window. Eli saw it too late. Silas had drawn a pistol and was aiming at her. With no time to think, Eli stepped into the line of fire. The shot rang out, grazing his shoulder, the heat of it burning through his coat. He fired back, hitting Silas in the leg. The outlaw dropped to one knee, snarling, but before he could raise his pistol again, Clara was at the door, shotgun in hand. "This ends here, Silas," she said, her voice low but carrying. Silas's gaze flicked between them, calculating. He saw the barrel aimed at his heart, the cold in Eli's eyes, the traps and the dead or dying men around him, and for the first time, he looked uncertain. Eli stepped forward, blood seeping into his sleeve. "Ride down the mountain and don't come back, or you won't make it past the next ridge." Silas's jaw tightened, but he signaled to the two men still standing. They dragged him away, limping, vanishing into the dark woods. The silence afterward was deafening, broken only by the slow hiss of falling snow. Inside, Clara helped Eli out of his coat, her hands gentle on his wounded shoulder. "You didn't have to take that bullet for me," she said softly. "I know," Eli replied, "but I wanted to." She looked at him for a long moment, her eyes shining. "Then I guess it's settled." "What is?" he asked. "You and me," she said, a faint smile tugging at her lips. "Not because you paid $2, but because you stayed." And as the snow fell heavy outside, sealing the world in white, Eli knew the fight had changed them both. In the Old West, not every story ended with a wedding ring or a tidy ending, but sometimes survival itself was the vow.